The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. MassMutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a MassMutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
This episode of Bring Back V10s is brought to you by F1 Experiences, the official experience, hospitality and travel program of Formula One. Official ticket packages are available now for the season-ending Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in December, so you can witness the last race of the year in style. I'm Glenn Freeman, and with me this time is Scott Mitchell. Scott, we've been scanning the range of packages on offer for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and if you were allowed to skip work for that weekend to enjoy the race with F1 Experiences, what would you make sure you did while you were there?
Well, I had a bit of a look through what they have to offer, and I was super tempted to go for even a virtual garage tour is super cool. So even if you can't do the real thing, going behind the scenes virtually is always interesting. But I've decided I'd have to pick something that gives me the chance for the championship trophy photo, because back in 2016 I was about a foot away from Nico Rosberg and his championship trophy, and I came so close to leaning in sneakily behind his back to take a selfie, and I chickened out at the last minute. So I need to rectify that. So that's what I'd be going for, something that offered me that opportunity.
Well, that sounds like the perfect way to put it right. There's so much to choose from. I was finding it quite difficult to decide. But then I saw a video that we got to upload onto the race website showing the panoramic views that are on offer from what they call the Champions Club. And for Abu Dhabi, not necessarily a circuit you think of as scenic, the view looked incredible. So I'd be plonking myself there and treating myself to some hospitality and some good trackside views. But that's what we'd go for. To find out more and to book your own F1 experience, visit f1experiences.com. Did you miss us? It's time to finish Series 3 of Bring Back V10s after a short break. And as always, we've got 2 episodes dedicated to your questions about F1 from 1989 to 2005 to see us to the end. Apologies for going missing for a couple of weeks, and thank you to everyone who asked how my house move went. I'm happy to report that almost all of the boxes are unpacked and most of the leaky taps and pipes have been dealt with. But let's not waste any more time talking about that. You've waited long enough for the first of our finale episodes, and to thank you for your patience, we're going to cram in even more questions than we usually do. Joining me, Glenn Freeman, to tackle the first set of questions we've picked out are Mark Hughes and ex-F1 Technical Director Gary Anderson. So Gary, welcome back to Bring Back V10s. As usual, when we have you on at the end of the series, we found a few Jordan-related questions for you. So which question are you most looking forward to? One of those or something completely different?
Well, something completely different, but I think quite fitting. I suppose really with the controversy we had last year with the Racing Point and the Mercedes, I think the Ligier and the Benetton question is going to be quite an interesting one.
Yeah, we got asked that more than once, so that question is definitely going to be fun. Mark Hughes, what about you? What's caught your eye in this longer list than usual?
Somebody's asked a question about my favourite driver, so I'm looking forward to that.
Excellent. We'll find out who that is shortly. I think I have an idea of who it might be, but let's get on with it. All of these questions either came from people using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter or submitting a question along with a 5-star podcast review, which we really appreciate. So we'll do a quick shout out to some of our reviewers, as the support you all show us does mean a lot. So thank you to Sean 518848, Burger and Alacy, Jeff 17, The Cool Parent, The Shaded Gamer, and B Smith 303. As I say every week, there are more of you leaving reviews than we can keep up with on these shout outs, and we're totally blown away by your support. But let's crack on and get some questions answered. Mark, the first question is from Brendan, who asks, was Justin Wilson a huge loss to F1, and why wasn't he given a proper chance with Jaguar?
I would love to have seen Justin have a better crack at Formula One. He came in 2003 with Minardi, and he looked fantastic in that. It was an outclass car, but he did very similar things in it to what Fernando Alonso had done a couple of years before and Mark Webber did the year after, and would get it a little bit further up the grid than it should have been, and then would make some fantastic passing moves on the opening lap, and you'd quite often see him come past end of the first lap halfway up the field, which was ridiculous, and it wouldn't be able to stay there, but it just showed you that he had such great natural racecraft, and he was able to always know where to place the car in traffic, and he was renowned for doing the big overtakes. He was a fantastic race driver. And he got a chance halfway through the season to get in the Jaguar alongside Mark Webber. And it didn't really work out there. Webber was absolutely knitted into that team by then. And he's such a competitive, intense character. He wouldn't have been extending a helping hand, let's say. The team took its lead from Mark, and he was a very inspiring character. Justin was more happy-go-lucky, passive, very talented, but different sort of personality. So, yeah, the car didn't really... he wasn't as at home in it as he had been in the Minardi, let's say. And Mark was very, very good at actually getting the last little bit from it in qualifying, and he was very, very fast, so over one lap. So he didn't quite do enough to make it a no-brainer that he was retained. And when Ford decided at the end of the year that it had enough of spending a fortune and instructed the team to take on a sponsored driver alongside Webber for 2004, so we got the Red Bull sponsored Christian Klein. It wasn't a bad driver, but it just meant that Justin's F1 chance was sort of over before it barely really started, and it was such a shame.
Yeah, I think, whenever you consider that he only had 4 races in the Jaguar at the end of the season, and, he did finish 8th in one of those, and that was no easy task, because during the season, Webber had 3 6s and 4 7s. So, he fit it in there quite well. But the one thing you have to remember was, I think he was 6'3", and in those days, the cars themselves, they didn't have a limit, a regulation as far as the cockpit opening is concerned, from the driver's seat back to the front bulkhead. Now they do have that minimum distance, but then they didn't. So any tall driver, you reach 6 foot, 6'1", and it definitely became a compromise. So, I genuinely think that if Justin had had a chance to establish himself, and then a team, whatever the team would be, would build a car for the next year that wouldn't compromise his seating position so much, then I think there was a step for him to take there. But jumping into the Jaguar would have been very, very difficult for him. Again, Webber's not small, but Justin Wilson was just that bit taller. So, it's the environment, it's that little home office that you're sitting in, and it needs to be as good as possible. And, jumping in to 4 races with a different team is never a good opportunity to really show your true potential. So I think he was very talented. People that worked with him in the States after his Formula One campaign, rated him very, very highly. And there's no difference. Racing's racing, whether it's Indy cars or whether it's Formula One. If you've got the talent, you've got the talent.
Now, going from a driver who only got 1 season in F1 to a driver who never quite raced in F1, but there was a lot of curiosity around this man. We received a few questions about Valentino Rossi testing with Ferrari and if it ever could have led anywhere. Paul Glover and Daniel Pryor were 2 of the people to ask about this. Mark, Paul says, how close did Valentino Rossi come to driving for Ferrari in F1? Could he have actually raced for them?
They flirted with each other, let's say, over several years. I think the closest it got was probably 2007 when he did a proper serious test alongside, must have been 2006 alongside Michael. And but they never quite committed. I never got the sense that Valentino was totally convinced it's what he wanted to do. It would have been a very big commitment. He had plenty of talent, though. I mean, he was quick. Even just using Michael as a comparison, it was less than a second. We don't know if that was like for like, but he was sort of in the ballpark for someone that it was really an alien sport for. So I think it would have needed a bit more serious intent to actually make it happen. Look at Damon Zamelo was talking about if he was very much he was pushing the idea of third cars for the big teams. And his big thing was if Ferrari was allowed to run a third car, he would love to put Valentino Rossi in it. And I think that would have been his best opportunity, but that, of course, that was never passed. That was never rubber stamped that would be okay to run a third car. So yeah, I think ultimately it was probably Valentino who shied away from it, and I think if he'd wanted to make it happen, he could have made it happen, and it just wasn't quite to be.
Yeah, I also think that he was at a time in his bike career where it was just too good. You know, he was having to decide not only the fact that he liked the motor racing, but he was enjoying the bikes, and he was very, very successful. So he was at a point of a major decision, you know, potentially drop all that success. I mean, what would he have been then, 25 or something? So I suppose it was at the height of his bike career, and he just needed to take the best out of that, really. He'd put a lot of effort into his bike career. So big decision to change. It'd be, you know, like a golfer that was very good at playing golf, deciding to go and play tennis. Yeah, they both got a ball, but at the end of the day, it's actually quite different. So I think he made the right decision because it would never have been easy for him, but he's never been frightened of a challenge. So it'd been lovely to see him do even, you know, some more testing, guest testing, proper testing with a big mix of cars around him to see really how he could have unfolded his true talent. But we'll never see that now, I don't think.
No, it would have been great. And to be fair to Valentino, he's won many more races and a few more championships since deciding not to do it. So I don't think we can criticise the decision. Now, Gary, got a question here from Graham Horner. Graham asks, what if Damon Hill had signed for Jordan in 97? I've always thought the 197 was a great car with two inexperienced drivers, those of course being Ralf Schumacher and Giancarlo Fisichella. Graham says, would Damon have won races in 97 due to his greater experience? What do you think, Gary? The 197, I know, is a car you're very proud of. Could Damon have got it over the line if he joined in 97 instead of 98?
Yeah, I think he would have done, to be honest. You know, we lost some races due to our own inexperience and, you know, the two new drivers' inexperience. Argentina, you know, basically we were in line there for good podium finishes anyway, you know, and with Damon had brought that little bit extra. And again in Germany, it was very close, but just the pressure, I think, got to Fizzy a little bit, and also, you know, he got a puncture in the end of the day, running over a bit of an engine from Magnussen's Ford engine that blew up in the Stewart. So it was, you know, when it's not to be, it's not to be. But I think what Damon would have brought in 97 to us was better than what he probably brought to us in 98, because he had that rundown year, almost won in Hungary, obviously, for Wilkinshaw, but then it was about keeping going as opposed to trying to replace what he had at Williams the year before. You know, coming to Jordan in 97 would have been very good for him because he would have jumped into a pretty decent car, I believe. But it wasn't to be, and, you know, it's the old if and but of motorsport, isn't it? What if this had happened? I would like to have seen it happen, and I'd like to have seen one mature driver in there against with one of the youngsters as well, instead of two youngsters. But at the end of the day, we had what we had, and they did a great job, and it was a very enjoyable season because the car was a major step forward from the 96 car. So it was nice to see that. It was nice to see the drivers get in there and really wring its neck. Yeah, a few mistakes were made, but that's life, I suppose. We all make them.
And I'm going to put a follow-up question to you here that relates slightly to that 96 car, because recently we had Jonathan Williams on the show, and he told a story that when Sam Michael moved from Jordan to Williams, he said that if Nigel Mansell had tested the 97 Jordan rather than the 96 car that he ran in December of that year, Sam Michael reckons Mansell would have made a comeback with Jordan. Now, Gary, you and Ed Straw have talked about that Mansell test in the past, and I'm sure we'll come back to it in the future. But do you think that would the 97 car have been such a step from the 96 that Nigel might have thought, actually, I do fancy this?
Yeah, it was actually a massive step. I mean, the first test we did was at Jerez, I think it was, Ralf Schumacher. And Ralph was there with the 96 car, just getting some miles in it during the winter. And the 97 car arrived, he got into it, and within 5 laps, he was over a second faster. So the car was a completely different beast, to be honest. The engine package from Peugeot was a stepped improvement, but the chassis itself was a chassis that made sense, I think you might call it. You know, we threw away a lot of stuff in 97 by just we tried to be too clever, I think, on a few things, and didn't really get the best out of the car at a lot of races. And I think Nigel, if he had done a back-to-back, he would have seen that step and he would have believed in it, that we could keep on making that step. And I suppose instead of us making mistakes because of our two new drivers, either Damon Hill or Nigel, would have been a stabilising influence for us to sort of help us not go the wrong route. But Nigel was great, and in the 96 car, you know, Ralph was there with him, and Nigel, within 10 laps, was quicker than Ralph on that morning. But then he had to come in for a cup of tea because his hands were cold, and he never really went any quicker. But you know, at the end of the day, he did what he wanted to do. He wanted to get in a car, drive it hard, and see where he really was. And I think the minute he did that, and he saw, actually, this is okay, I'm all right here. I'm not, you know, I haven't lost anything, but I don't want to do it again. I think that was his big decision, and he had 2 cups of tea.
Now, we've already talked about Mark Webber once in this episode, but let's ask a more specific question about him. Rachel Fleming asks, would Mark Webber have challenged for the World Championship if he'd picked Renault over Williams? Now, Mark, you've always had a pretty good handle on Webber's career. Did he do himself out of a World Championship with the decision he made in the mid-2000s?
Maybe. He was he had the chance to go to Enston, where he would have been paired with Fernando Alonso in 2005 and 6, which is the year that the Renault won the championships with Alonso. So, yeah, he could have been there, and he turned that down. They were both managed by the same guy, Flavio Briatore, so it made sense for Briatore to bring them both into the fold of the team that he was running. But the decision was Mark's to make, and he just didn't fancy going up against Alonso. He had enormous respect and regard for Alonso as a competitor, and I think you saw that. And then whenever they got together, wheel to wheel, they were very, very close. I remember that when they went through a Rouge together with about, you know, fag paper width between their wheels, and many others. Like talked about Suzuka 2005 when Webber had Alonso on the grass getting wheel spin in top gear. So they were very, very competitive with each other, but I don't think Webber fancied going in to what was already Alonso's team, and he just didn't think that was the route to the World Championship, and he thought that being the team leader at Williams, which was not that long since had been a championship contending team back in 2003. He was going there in 2005. I think he felt that was probably a better route, and on paper it probably looked it, given those two situations. But Williams was a team that was probably on the way down really by then. It was wrestling with its own history really, rather than adapting to the future. And that was a relationship that never really gelled. And he could look back and think, yeah, maybe I should have given it a go at Renault, and we'll never know. So would he have been a championship contender? Yeah, possibly. But I don't think as an all-round package he would have. I think he would have found Fernando just a little bit too much of a handful.
Richard Johnston has a question specifically about V10 engines. He says, we had 16 years of V10s, much longer than the subsequent engine formulas. Were manufacturers still getting gains from the engines at the end? Were there any signs that they were getting close to the limits of the technology? But Mark, I'll throw this one to you first, because at the end of the V10 era, we just started having the longer life engine requirements. But performance-wise, were the manufacturers anywhere near that glass ceiling?
We kept waiting for it because for years we'd been told that the theoretical limit was 19,000 RPM, but clearly it wasn't, because by 2005, Cosworth, BMW were pushing 21,000 revs. And it just kept creeping up and up and up. And there was still performance being found, which was quite amazing, but it was from an ever more specialized discipline, if you like, with no real carryover for the automotives. It was taking them off in a different development direction that didn't really translate into the automotive side. But it was fascinating. It was all out. It is like, you know, an arms war, just absolutely flat out. But yeah, that was, I guess. I guess it was sensible that they started imposing limitations on it, because the teams were probably going to go bust if it just carried on. So it was a very exciting time, and no, there was no sign yet that we were reaching the sort of marginal gains. We still seem to be making big gains.
Yeah, I mean, anything like that is all about pushing the engineering challenge. Every time you turn a corner with the chassis or the car, you learn something new, you adapt some new materials into the package, you can run the revs a little bit higher, or the fuel gets better, the combustion chamber gets better, so you can actually make a shorter stroke, bigger bore, and still get the fuel to burn on the piston area. You know, it's all just incremental steps whenever you get to that point. And it's exactly the same right now. You know, very, very different from what we got now, but it's still all incremental steps. You know, they're still moving forward. Mercedes, you know, will have a better package this year than they had last year as far as the engine power unit's concerned, as we call it now. Honda definitely have. Ferrari, I'm pretty sure, have. So they're all just making those incremental steps, and as you do that, you learn something new. So I don't think it'll ever stop. The returns get smaller for sure, but they were great engines. You know, one of those things singing along at 20,000, 21,000 RPM was just mega, to be honest, absolutely mega. You know, I suppose you could say we missed them, but we missed them for a different reason. They used to hurt you. You know, whenever you're standing in the pit lane, if you didn't have your earplugs in, they actually hurt you. So maybe they should have been banned. Maybe we should have gone the route we are. But at the end of the day, there's nothing like one of those. If you ever start one up in the pit lane and run it around the track, as Alonso did last year, I think, with the Renault, you know, people will stand up and look at it, because it is a racing car. It is a racing engine. It's a racing noise. You know, just sucks you in like nothing else.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. And I remember during that era, when people would go to see an F1 car in action for the first time, the thing they would comment on almost before the speed and any other sensations you get from watching trackside was always the sound. People always said the sound, the noise. And yeah, I mean, I didn't take your advice, Gary. I didn't wear my earplugs when I was trackside as a fan back at Silverstone and even Imola once back in the day. And my hearing, the state of my ears has certainly paid the price for that. I think I have pretty bad hearing for a 35-year-old. But let's move on to another Jordan-related question. Andy Villa GB, one of our many reviewers, asks, if the 2003 Brazilian GP had run the full distance, did Fisichella have to pit again for fuel? And if so, where would he have finished? Now, Gary, we will definitely do a full episode on this race in the future, because as well as the amazing Jordan victory, there was so much else going on at the time. But in terms of Jordan's clever strategy to bring the tank earlier in the race, without the red flag bringing things to a close early, what would have happened to Fisichella?
Well, it's the old question of if. It's F1 backwards, but who knows, I suppose, is the answer. We did our calculations based on the lap time that we would be doing if it was wet, and based on the lap time that you know the cars would have done in the wet, if there had been no red flags and stuff, the race would still have got stopped. With just to run the 2 hours, you know, it wouldn't have gone over too far. So although we had a calculation, I think it was lap 54 or something, that we could get to with a full tank of fuel, when the race was red flagged at that point in time, that was a 2/3 race distance, we would have had enough fuel in it to have gone to, I think it was lap 62 or 64. So we could have got a bit more out of it. But we would have had to have stopped at some point in time if the race went the complete distance. But we didn't think it would go the complete distance because of the slow lap times. So there was a twofold solution there. One was it got stopped early because of basically everybody just getting bored, because it was constant, you know, safety car, crash, safety car crash, so on and so forth. And you can only do that for so long. You can't just keep on going all afternoon. Everybody was soaking. It was cold. It was, you were wet through from head to foot. And also the fact, as I say, the lap times dictated that the race probably wouldn't have run its full distance. It would run its full time. So again, it's impossible to know what would have happened. We would have had to stop again for fuel, and I doubt if we would have been able to have won it from there. So we bought a lottery ticket, and it was the right numbers on it. So that's all I can say at this point in time.
Yeah, I think it paid off. And even if Jordan hadn't won the race, based on how good, or should I say bad, that car was, you were in for a better result than you'd have got if you'd done the same as everybody else.
Yeah, you are. I mean, as I say, you can only try and take your set of circumstances in front of you and try and come up with the best solution possible to do something. The car was never a great package, but it, again, it was probably better than the results that we got out of it. It wouldn't have caught fire on that lap that it did when it came into the pits, because that was just there was an oil storage tank that basically we had to put more oil into the tank. Because of the way the engine was consuming oil. And basically it was a plastic pipe that a tie wrap had come undone and it had fallen onto the exhaust pipe whenever he stopped in the pit lane, because it just all got a bit too hot. But that wouldn't have happened if the car had been kept running. It just happened because he stopped in the pit lane with it all, boiling its brains out. So it melted the tie wrap, the pipe fell onto the exhaust pipe, the oil that was in the pipe caught fire. So it would have been good to see, but we achieved the goal of giving ourselves an opportunity to do something, and that opportunity came our way. So you've got to take it and say, yeah, we did all right that day.
Now, Mr. Wapajif has a great question, because he's come up with a way for us to talk about Gilles Villeneuve. So, Mark, the question quite simply is, when do you think Gilles would have retired had he survived beyond 1982? And the way Mr. Wapajif has made this a Bring Back V10s question is, he says, would he have been battling Senna for titles by 1989? So what do you reckon, Mark? Map out the rest of the 80s for Gilles Villeneuve.
This is the question I was referring to earlier on.
I thought it might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great what ifs. He was the fastest driver of his time, and he'd resolved that he was leaving Ferrari at the end of 82 because he didn't feel supported by the team in the fallout from Imola when he'd had the falling out with Pironi. So he was off, and he was going to be a hot property on the market. Ron Dennis had been trying to recruit him to McLaren for a good couple of years by then. And logically, I think that's where he would have ended up. He would have ended up alongside Lauda there in 83. He would have probably replaced John Watson. So that would have put him in a Cosworth car in the time that the turbos were dominating, but he would have been in the perfect place to get the McLaren Porsches for 84, 85. So my hunch is that he would have been a lot quicker than Nicky at that stage of Nicky's career, and it probably would have brought about Nicky's retirement a bit earlier. Which you then say, well, would there have ever been a place for Prost at the end of 83 if Lauda and Villeneuve were there? Maybe not. Maybe they'd gone to Lotus or something like that. So yeah, it's just one of those what ifs. He would have been definitely sitting in. If he'd gone to McLaren, which was the most logical option, given it was probably the best team available, had great prospects, and Ron Dennis was trying very hard to recruit him, so why wouldn't he have gone there? Then yes, I think he would have blown the nonsense idea that he couldn't have won titles because of the way he was out of the water, because he would have won titles there, I'm sure. Would he have still been around by 89? He would have been 38 years old then. So, yeah, I guess he would have been. I can't imagine that he would actually have retired. I think he would have just hung on until Formula One retired him, and then he would have gone and done something else, some other form of racing. I guess he was just mad for it. So, yeah, I think there would have been a fascinating overlap between him and Senna, probably mid to late 80s, definitely.
The interesting thing there, I was at the other end of the scale on the Villeneuve career. I did the first test at Silverstone with him in the McLaren. And, you could see from lap one, it was a bit like Michael Schumacher, when he drove the Jordan, he did a shakedown test at Silverstone around the South Circuit, and Michael, you could see from lap one that he just had some talent that I'd never seen before, and Villeneuve was the same. He just went out, and he never thought that he was just new in Formula One. He just knew how to do it, and very quick from lap one. So it'd been interesting to have seen if he'd had. I think he needed a team like McLaren to go to, really, to try to pull him into line a little bit. He had the talent, he had the speed, he had everything, but he probably didn't quite have the discipline. And I think going to a team that had a management structure as opposed to Ferrari, that discipline might have been pulled into him a little bit. That it was all about getting to the checkered flag. He had some fantastic drives. I think it was Harama, 82 was it?
81.
I think 81. I was there and watching that race, and it was just, it shouldn't have been, but it was, and he did. So somebody could have disciplined him to do that every weekend. It would have been just amazing what the end result would have been.
What Mark said has now got me thinking. He was talking about him racing on and on and on, and then what would he have done afterwards? So I've decided he would have gone to IndyCar in the early 90s, and then we'd have had the Andrettis and the Villeneuves.
Fantastic.
In championship at the same time. So there you go. We got a Jacques mention in, even though there's no questions about him. But let's move on. Mark, we're coming forward towards the end of our era with this next one, because the question from T. Sean Busy is about the F2004, Ferrari's stunning car from the year with the same name. The question is, what made the F2004 so dominant? Was it really that much better than the rest, or did everybody else fall off a cliff?
Oh, what was so good about it? Aero, engine, custom tyre development with Bridgestone, Michael Schumacher, Ross Brawn, Rory Byrne, John Tott. All
a few
focused.
Things then.
Yeah, good ingredients. And actually that...
Mark, why don't we start with what was bad about it?
Yeah, I can't
because
think of anything. Can you?
The list would probably be a lot shorter.
Yeah. I mean, it was the fully resolved reaction to the late notice parc fermé regulations that had been introduced in 2003, which had caught Ferrari out because they had made a long car on the assumption that you would still continue to be able to change the weight distribution in between qualifying and race, and it give the not enough weight on the front for qualifying. So they did a shorter car for 04, which had the ideal weight distribution for the parc fermé regulations. And therefore, what you were seeing really was just a continuation of its actual position, more like 2002 had been, without the artificial handbrake of the regulations. That said, BMW were hurt by the new engine regs. They didn't go ahead with what was going to be a sensational new engine, because of the mileage limits that were going to be applied. McLaren was struggling with a bit of technical infighting with Adrian and the management there. So it's true, they weren't at their absolute peak, those two teams, and they probably should have been punching a bit harder than they were. But if you bring that bunch of people together and you give them an unlimited budget, why wouldn't they be as dominant as they were? They were just it was the standard. It was the absolute gold standard of the time.
Yeah, if I had to pick not one part of it, I suppose it's impossible to pick one part of it. I think the relationship they built with Bridgestone was second to none. During 2003, it was very good as well. As you say, they suffered because of the parc fermé rule situation, but during 2003, as a Bridgestone team, we got what you got. Whereas, we wouldn't get. We tested a couple of times on Ferrari tyres, mainly because Bridgestone needed some more mileage on them, and the difference was incredible. We had a very good tyre in what we had. We had a copy of the tyre that Ferrari used, but the materials used in it were all different and much, much cheaper. The Ferrari tyres were a much more expensive solution to the sidewall stiffness, and hence the weight of the tyre was different. The structure of the tyre was different, but mainly coming from the different materials. It's a bit like when we're talking about the V10s, and material technology improves and improves and improves, but it does get more and more expensive with that. So it's the same for any part of a racing car, any part of anything, and it was the same for the tyres at that point in time. the technology was improving dramatically, but as production basis, Bridgestone wouldn't use it in older tyres. So they had a big advantage there. But again, they had a very sound group of people all working in the same direction. And as you say, more importantly, with an unlimited budget. And they achieved their goals, 15 wins in the season, 13 to Michael Schumacher and 2 to Barrichello. It's a pretty good run.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal car. And I think that even if Williams and McLaren did have their acts together that year, they still wouldn't have beaten that car. That was, of course, the year of the famous Walrus Williams, which we will do an episode on in the future. And McLaren started the year with what they called the MP419, but as we learned in our MP418 episode, Adrian Newey says the car at the start of 04 was just the abandoned 03 car with what he's called a new sticker on it. But let's follow up on this a bit more, and let's mention the 2002 car again, because in that original question, T. Sean Busy asked which was the better overall package, the F2002 or the F2004. Gary, you can go first, because I sometimes feel that the F2002 gets overlooked because 2 years after it, another sensational car came along. Does one or the other stand out for you?
Well, yeah, I think, they're all from the same group of people, I suppose you might call it. 2002 was, again, that had 15 wins in the season, so they're equal in terms as far as that's concerned. You have to accept that group of people will only learn more and keep it all going together. So 2002, I think, was a learning curve for 2004. And that's why we look at 2004 saying it was so good, but they learned a lot during 2002. They probably weren't as closely in bed with Bridgestone in 2002 as they were in 2004, but they learned about all that. And that's why sort of the 2004 car, I think, just looks like it was better. But I think both of them, I'd be very happy to be being behind either one of those two cars. But, Michael at that point in time was a phenomenal driver as well. He just had that belief and faith in the whole thing. And, just again, as Mark said earlier, the unlimited budget always helps. We were always fighting for the last few pounds to save here and there, whatever, but, they didn't have to think about that side of it. And Ross was always very good as well at manipulating the grey area of the regulations to get the best out of it to suit himself. It was one of those situations. I'm not saying they ever went past the grey area, but they were always able to find the grey area and make sure there was grey areas there that would help Ferrari. I think he'll admit that himself. That was his task. That was his job. So at the end of the day, that group were able to achieve the goal with the 2002 car and the 2004 car. So 2003 was a bit of a blip in the middle, but it still didn't do too bad.
Yeah, it's okay if you win a championship in your blip year. But Mark, what do you think? How do you compare the F2002 and the F2004?
Two great cars. I guess the 2004 just edges it. It was a sort of more refined version of the same idea, really. After they'd backed out of the concept of the 2003 because it had been made obsolete. Two sensational cars, and it was really just a continuation of the same program, really.
Let's bring in another sensational car and keep the comparison theme going, because we also had a question from Herr Laurence, who said, which was the most dominant car of the V10 era, the F2004 or the Williams FW14B, which of course was Nigel Mansell's 1992 car. So where do you go with that, Mark? Are you looking purely at the stats, or is there another way to interpret which car was more dominant?
The Williams introduced a completely new technology, that the others didn't have, or hadn't developed it to the same peak. So you were comparing almost like a new generation car to previous generation cars. It was that big a leap. So it was enormous. There were certain circuits in 92 where if you qualified 2 seconds off the Williams or off Nigel Mansell's Williams, you'd be third on the grid. It was just ridiculous how dominant that car was. So in terms of its performance advantage over everything else, the Williams was more dominant, and the Ferrari was more of an exploitation to the nth degree of a more restrictive set of regulations, and so you couldn't get the same probably lap time dominance from it, although they did manage to find a big advantage given how restrictive the regulations were. So it was a more rounded package. It was a more rounded team. It was a bigger team, a better financed team. So the end result, the Ferrari was, in terms of, if you look at the record book, it would be the Ferrari. But in terms of just how much faster than everything else, it was the Williams.
Yeah, I think the Williams was one of those cars where as you said there, Mark, Nigel Mansell's Williams. I think it was a Nigel Mansell Williams for sure. It's a bit like what we see now with the Max Verstappen Red Bull. You had to commit to it. You had to commit to that car. Not every driver could do it. And Nigel, if Patrick Head would tell him something, Nigel would believe it and go out there and do it. And I remember the big debate about telling Nigel that, if the faster he goes through cops, the more grip he'll have, so the faster he can go. And he goes faster through cops because that's what he was told to do. So it's about that belief in it. If it's there, it comes with it. And so many drivers, don't drive the car they've got. They upset the car quite a lot, and this is where left foot braking and come into play, because lots of people, whenever left foot braking started to be the big thing, lots of people would use the left foot braking, but to slow the car down. But the good guys were using it actually to keep the balance of the car through a corner. And like cops at that point in time, it was one of those things where Michael Schumacher would tell Ralph Schumacher, you just have to kiss the brake, your left foot on the brakes going through the corner, just keep it in 7th gear and it's flat through there. But Ralph wouldn't do that. He'd put the brakes on at the wrong time. All Michael was doing was just putting a little bit of brake on it to stop the oversteer, because you take the drive out of the rear wheels. So it was about using it as a tool to drive the car as opposed to a thing to stop the car. And Nigel would do that. And I think Nigel would listen to people who had designed the car and understood how they went about the design of the car, and he would drive it to suit that. And that's a very big thing. The same as Max Verstappen right now does with the Red Bull. He drives the car to the condition that the sort of designers have decided to put the concept around. That's very important.
We'll stick with Williams for this next question, because if 92 was the start of the team's 90s dominance, then 97 into 98 was the end of it, and Chris United 93 actually sent us enough questions for an episode of his own, which was incredible. But the subject we're going to pick up from all of those questions is about Williams's fall from grace in 98. So Chris asked a couple of questions around this, where he said, if Adrian Newey had stayed at Williams, would their 98 car have been less of a disaster? And could it have been in contention with Mechachrome engines? And then he followed up saying, and if Renault didn't pull out at the end of 97, would the loss of Newey still have had an impact, even with a works engine? And then from our reviews, MPH GB81 sums it up quite well, simply saying, what hurt Williams most in 1998? Was it Newey leaving or Renault pulling out? So Mark, what do you reckon?
They're both very serious blows. I would say long term, the biggest blow was probably the loss of Adrian, because you can always get another automotive engine manufacturer, but you can't just go and get another Adrian. So, but they were both very big blows. The loss of Renault as a works sort of partner, if you like, meant that engine was no longer being developed. It was essentially frozen, while Mercedes and Ferrari were on a very, very fruitful development program. And I think by the end of 98, they were probably running an extra 100 horsepower to where they'd been at the end of 97. It was that aggressive a development program as they both poured money into it. So you were never going to have made that up just from the chassis, but taking a double hit, obviously they went from dominance in 97 to nowhere in 98, and that was just, it came at a bad time as well, because the major regulation changes for 98, and then they really needed to be fully exploited. So there was a lot of low-hanging fruit there probably, and Adrian would have been absolutely perfect for that, and instead he was doing a similar thing for McLaren.
Yeah, it was quite funny, 97 to 98, it was a big change. And I mean, we went through, as everybody did, many steps of wheelbase. You were moving the front wheels forward 5 centimetres or something one weekend, and you were moving them back 5 centimetres next weekend and moving the rear end back and forth. It was a nightmare trying to get back in terms with the tyre change. Patrick Head's been renowned for sort of being able to shout over most Grand Prix cars. He's fairly loud when he tries to say something. I remember hearing him, this is on the grid, and I remember saying, Jeff, where are you? And it was Jeff Willis, who was the chief aerodynamist at the time. And I was listening to them just out of curiosity. Jeff, it's underbody airflow. That's what we've missed. Underbody airflow, Jeff, that's where it all lies nowadays. And, in reality, it was right, because at that point in time, what you had was an engine and a chassis and some radiators in the side pods and a bodywork over the top of it. And now these current cars, because of underbody airflow, they've got a bodywork underneath the bodywork. So basically, you're trying to, optimize that efficiency of cooling so much more. And the more optimum you get that, the more downforce you can create out of the car, as opposed to just having a big hole at the back of the car. Now it's all ducted within itself. So Patrick was really right. Underbody airflow, Jeff. Underbody airflow. That's where our problems are. He was totally committed to it.
I'm sure exactly what Jeff Willis needed on the grid was to be bellowed at with what he'd got wrong with that car. Our next question is from Danny Hoare, and Mark, he asks, would you say the 2000 Japanese Grand Prix is underrated due to the dominance of Ferrari in the years that followed? Title on the line and the conditions were tricky as they come. This was, of course, the race where Michael Schumacher finally won his first championship for Ferrari, and it's a nail-biting thriller, isn't it, between Michael and Mika Hakkinen, with a bit of drizzle around one of the pit stops and towards the end. So do you think it does maybe get forgotten because of where it placed in what became Ferrari's dominance of the early 2000s?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it was actually the actual pivot point. You could almost say that race was the actual pivot point between the McLaren era and then the end of the McLaren era and the beginning of the Ferrari era. And that whole season was fought out very, very closely between Hakkinen and Schumacher. First, one of them would be leading the championship, then the other. And then it came to that race, and Mika took the early lead, chased by Michael, and they were both head and shoulders faster than everybody else, left everybody else well behind. It was just the most fantastic way to decide a title, just a flat-out scrap between the two best drivers, and they were the two best drivers of that time. And it all hinged on the timing of the pit stop. So Mika came in first, and this is a time of refueling, and as he went out, the drizzle had just started, so he struggled to get the tires straight up to temperature because of the drizzle, whereas Michael was still going round on his hot old tires, and that enabled him to come out. I can't remember 3 or 4 laps later when he stopped, it enabled him to come out just in front, and that was it. He cracked it, and from there that was the beginning of Ferrari's run, which would go on to define a whole era. But that was it. That little bit of drizzle was the switching point between those two eras.
Yeah, it's difficult to say because any one race can be just a set of circumstances. But I always remember it because it was the 2 races that we sort of tried to pull Jaguar back together again. We'd had a pretty torrid season. With Eddie driving for us, he had a good understanding of the Ferrari from the year before. So it was quite interesting because we went to there, qualified 7th with Eddie, and as far as it was a second off the pace, but as far as he was concerned, he was driving a better car than the Ferrari had the year before, and that's why you say there, Mark. It was the start of Ferrari getting on top of everything, the whole package, and making it all work for him. That race was a big turning point for Ferrari, just in the fact that it sort of taught them confidence, I suppose, in everything, and that they were going in the right direction. Knowing from Eddie how Ferrari operated from the year before was interesting, I suppose you might call it, because I don't think it was always completely black and white that Irvine got the exact same car as Michael did. So yeah, a change of direction, I suppose, but Ferrari dominated from there on in really for quite a long time. So it was one of those sort of situations where it was a big race for the development of Ferrari.
This is a significant race for Michael as well. When Autosport magazine got Michael to choose his favourite race for the relaunch of the Race of My Life feature that ran back then. Michael chose this race, so it obviously meant quite a lot to him as well. But let's move on with another Jordan question for Gary. Peter Foster asks, why is it that Jordan couldn't partner anybody with Rubens Barrichello in 1993? They seem to bounce between having big names of the time to relative nobodies and then promising young talents. So for context here, Barrichello's teammates over the course of 93 were Ivan Capelli, Thierry Boutsen, Marco Apicella, Emanuele Naspetti, and of course, by the end of the year, Eddie Irvine. So Gary, give us the inside story. What was going on?
Well, there's nothing going on that I really knew about. I mean, we obviously, being a small team, there was financial restrictions as to who you could have and who could bring some money and all that sort of stuff. I think we started the season with Ivan Capelli and Rubens as clear candidates for the season. I mean, they were there, they were chosen, and it was part of making that all work. I think we got some money from Marlborough to take Capelli and Rubens. So there was money behind it, but it wasn't the driving factor for those first two. But Ivan never really sort of seemed to recover from his getting fired by Ferrari. You know, I think when he hit his head on the wall in Montreal, I think it was turn 4, that fast left-hand chicane, and he caught the curb there, and the car sort of tipped up, and he banged his head on the wall. And many people say he was never the same person after that. Difficult to say. I didn't really know him that much before that. Obviously, I met up with him in Formula 3 and Formula 3000 and stuff, but never in F1. And he showed in the Leighton House, he obviously had the talent, but he never really come to terms with his Ferrari drive. And obviously getting sacked by Ferrari 2 races from the end of the season meant that he was trying to build up that career. But from day one with us, I never felt there was somebody in the car that was going to lead us or take us anywhere. And then obviously he had a big shunt in South Africa. And I think he didn't qualify at the next race in Brazil or something. So it was one of those sort of difficult situations. And then, you know, the change was made because of sponsorship pressure. And, you know, Terry Boutsen arrived. And Terry was strange because he couldn't, I mean, really and truthfully, he was too big for our car. The car was quite a small package. And Terry was too big for the car. To fit him in the car was an absolute nightmare. But he got in there, and at Donington, I think he drove exceptionally well for the conditions, for the situation that he was in. At that time, we were developing an electronic gear change, and we were having some reliability problems with it for very strange reasons. But that's another V10 episode probably. It could fill the whole V10 episode, to be honest. But Terry drove very well with a manual gear change, and then we converted the car, put a new seat back in it, and moved a few bits and pieces around in the chassis because we had time to do it. And he never ever sort of drove like that again. You couldn't just see that commitment. And I think Hungary was he finished 9th maybe in Hungary, or 8th or 9th. And he came in after the race, and you know, Hungary, it was 30 odd degrees, and there wasn't a bead of sweat on him. You know, and I said to him, you know, you sure there shouldn't be a bead of sweat on your brow after a drive around this place? Oh, I don't sweat. He was looking for his retirement payment and, you know, early retirement, I suppose you might call it. And he worked on that really, and he got it at the end of the day. And then from there on in, it was a fallout of smaller drivers, lesser drivers that might bring a few dollars to the budget type thing. The car wasn't good, and it took us until I think it was Estoril before we sort of got on top of the problem and sort of fixed it. And by the time we got to Japan, the car was in a reasonable state, and Irvine showed that it was capable to score some points.
Yeah, a classic Eddie Jordan revolving door of drivers when you need a bit of cash and you're struggling at the back of the grid, perhaps. But let's get on to what Gary picked out earlier as his favourite question on this list. And we had more than one question about this situation. Racing Steward asked if Ligier were using a Benetton B195 with a Mugen engine in 1995, and Winning F104 left a question in a review asking why those two cars were so similar. So before I throw to Gary, I should say that Flavio Briatore brought this up on his Beyond the Grid F1 podcast with Tom Clarkson, And Flavio actually brought it up completely unprompted. There was no question along these lines. He of course owned both teams at the time, and reflecting on that, he said, every race after the race, my car was taken to pieces by the FIA because I decided to have Benetton help Ligier like everybody else has done before. Every race, our car and Ligier's was taken to pieces to check they are not the same. Our teams were the last one to leave every race because of the inspections by the FIA. And we mentioned earlier in this series that one of the reasons John Barnard fell out with Benetton in 1991 was because Briatore wanted to, in John's words, have Ligier effectively run Benetton bits. So if you want to hear more about that side of the story, check out our Canada 91 episode. But Gary, the floor is yours. Jordan was a midfield rival of Ligier in 95. So were you particularly upset by what could be perhaps described as a Benetton in blue French clothing?
Yes, I think we were quite upset because, one of the jokes that we used to have was the fact that they didn't have to bring spare noses for each car because they could just use whatever was in the pit lane. Benetton could use the Ligier one and Ligier could use the Benetton one. For sure there was differences in the car. There always will be differences in the car. In reality, we're not far away from that now. It's a bit like Racing Point last year and Mercedes last year. When you take a quick visual look at it, the cars are the same. But obviously the detail is not the same. So you get into it. Each team makes its own car, but the overall visual aspect of it means that they look very, very similar. And I think Ligier and Benetton were like that year. The problem is, getting upset with it isn't something you can do. You have to hope that the regulations cover these sort of things. You can't, as an individual team, you can't go in there and start shouting because there is no point. There's regulations written and they're supposed to be respected, and you have to let the governing body govern and make those decisions, because if each individual team was to stick its nose into everything, you would never get anywhere. So we, at that point in time, allowed that to happen. And I think what Briatore is saying, yeah, it's true. They were inspected quite often, but what is the same? This is the problem. What is actually the same? It's a very difficult thing, and I think Barnard's right as well. He fell out with Benetton because of it. He didn't want that his knowledge to go anywhere else. And John Barnard was very, very determined that everything he did was top secret, hush hush. It was special, more special than anybody else would ever have, and he had to keep control of it. So that those parts that he had been party to would have gone off to another team, and they would have, learned from John Barnard, which is, it is the way it works, but it's not really the way it works. But as I say, the big thing is you've got to rely on the governing body. The governing body makes the rules. And all the time through my career in Formula One, I've had questions about some stuff that we either protested or we questioned or we looked at. And the answers, when you got it back from the FIA, they were manipulated to make it that the FIA was always right. No criticism of the FIA. It's a tough job because there's 10 teams out there and probably 2,000 engineers trying to find solutions, grey areas to everything that goes on at the moment. So no criticism of the FIA, but sometime you have to stand up and believe in what's real and what's black and white. And I think that the Ligier at that time, you could have taken the nose off the Ligier and put it on a Benetton, and it would have fitted. You might have to change the stripes a little bit here and there, but it wouldn't have been too far away.
Yeah, Mark, it's interesting, isn't it? Gary mentioned there, we've seen over the years and over the years since, so many cars where you could say, that looks quite close. And this is before Racing Point last year. You always saw cars you thought that they've copied as much as they can from this car. You can think of Toyotas and Saubers that started to look like Ferraris in the 2000s, that sort of thing. But I find it interesting that we had a clutch of questions about these cars specifically. So do you think the Benetton and Ligier example from 95 is perhaps one of the more extreme ones?
Yeah, I think probably was. I know that Alan Prost has got on record as saying when he took over the team, he found basically just as a race team, he didn't really have a design and development and department, and he had to sort of double the size of the team pretty much straight away because they needed a new car. So I think it was pretty clear that with what the basis was, they probably got round the letter of the regulation, let's say. But yeah, it's always happened. I mean, it happened before then as well, didn't it? It happened with the infamous Arrows and Shadow, which were the same car, and Arrows had to subsequently, after a court ruling, come up with a different car, which wasn't as good. There was the 79 Tyrrell, which was absolutely the same car as the 78 Lotus 78. So yeah, it's not a new thing, and it's it's still happening to this day. It's just where you draw the line, really. But I don't think there's any sort of darker side to it. It's just the situation that a team might find itself in. It might just be a shortcut to respectability while it builds up its own resources.
I've in my time in Formula One many years ago in the 70s, we actually came back to the track in Sweden, and at that time we were using a truck and an awning, and we saw a light underneath the awning, so we switched the lights off in the van we were driving and walked down there, went underneath the awning, and there was a team owner and a technical director, or whatever, like chief designer at that point in time, with a tape measure measuring up the rear suspension geometry on our Brabham BT44B. So it was it's quite interesting. It's never been different. People will do all sorts of stuff. It's just the way it is, I suppose. But as I say, my argument about it is if the rules exist to stop that sort of thing happening, then you have to implement those rules. And it'll only take once for people to learn that it's not the right way to go. We all copy, when I was designing parts, we all looked at everybody else's solutions, questioned why that would be, tested it probably in the wind tunnel, found out it was actually worse, and then went your own way. But you might have taken a little bit of a little bit of an idea from it. But that's not what I call copying. That's what that's in public domain stuff. But doing stuff behind, getting drawings, any of that sort of stuff, and that again it's not like two people chatting down the pub. It's about actual physical numbers, papers, drawings, or whatever. So that has to be stopped, because I think it is, the teams should be independent. I'm not saying there shouldn't be crossover parts, the stuff that doesn't matter. That's good, but as far as what we see, the aero surfaces of the car, they should be different, and they have to be a degree of difference in them for them not to be the same.
Mark's point about Alain Prost there is interesting as well. And in fact, I think it explains something else Flavio said, where he said, I sold the team to Alain Prost and with really good cars and really good equipment. And then as Prost took it over, they made it a lot worse. And I guess that's because of what Mark outlined there, that Prost had to start doing it all for themselves. But let's finish with a question about Mika Hakkinen and Kimi Räikkönen. Mark, Sammy P328 left us a 5-star review. Thank you, Sammy. And also asked, why did Mika Hakkinen never return from his sabbatical? And could he have won the 2003 title if he returned? Or by then was Kimi already the better driver?
I think just one word, really, desire. Mick had never made any secret of the fact of just how much a mental toll it took from him winning those 2 titles and fighting for that 3rd one. And when he stopped at the end of 2001, he was finished. He was mentally finished. He was exhausted, and he didn't want to do it anymore. Simple as that. And he'd had a near-death experience a few years before, and then he had a big shunt, which he got away with at the beginning of 2001, and I'm sure it brought back all the bad memories. And he just needed a rest, and he needed to know how much he really wanted it, and that's why he said it was a sabbatical, because he wanted to leave the way open if he did feel that desire to come back. And everybody's wired up differently, and different things affect different people in different ways. But he found it very, very mentally taxing to be going bat to bat with Michael Schumacher for 3 straight years, and he'd had enough of it. And I guess the answer to why he didn't come back was he didn't feel it. He didn't want to commit himself to that level of intensive energy anymore. I mean, he came back and did some DTM racing, but it wasn't on the same level of commitment as a Formula One program would have been. And so if you don't have that desire, no, you're not going to be able to fight for a world championship. It doesn't matter how talented you are. And he was one of the most talented drivers there's ever been in terms of raw speed. But no, if you can't match that up to the real dig deep stuff that you're going to have to do to win a championship, then no, you wouldn't have been in a position to win a title.
Yeah, and I think Mika has said a few times that really the sabbatical was Ron Dennis's idea, just to keep that door open, as you said, Mark, just in case the year off recharged the batteries. But I suspect what you described there was the real picture, that Mika was done and he knew he was, and by then Raikkonen was the coming man. So we'll leave it there for part 1 of our series finale. Thanks to Gary and Mark for piling through as many questions as we could fit in. We had over 120 submitted in the end through this series, so we could in fact probably dedicate the entire next series just to answering your questions. But before it comes to that, we'll see how many more we can fit in of the remaining ones next time when Series 3 comes to a close.